Spring came to Colleton County like a fever, heavy, airless, and insistently close, the kind of heat that dampened collars and softened candle wax before a match was ever struck. The Combe River slid past the rice fields in a slow black ribbon, carrying the smell of rot and brine and something sweet that never quite resolved. Like a lie told so often it sounded almost like truth. Cypress Grove sat back from the waterline on 800 middling acres. A two-story house with a bone-white portico, rice barns silvered with salt wind, and quarters aligned in narrow, punishing rows. It was the sort of place a man could pass for powerful, if no one looked too closely. Silas Rutland made a career of supplying the distance that allowed people not to look closely. Tall and spare, with hair gone wintry early and cheeks hollowed by the habit of skipping meals when his mind gnawed at numbers, he kept ledgers the way a priest keeps scripture. His handshake had the firmness of a contract, and when he smiled as seldom as he did, it was the weary smile of a man who believed he had paid for the privilege. He had married once, a practical union to Elizabeth Yancey that added a modest tract and a reputable name. Elizabeth died, giving birth to their daughter in 1813, and Silas raised the child alone with the precise attention one gives to a banknote, to be guarded, endorsed properly, and exchanged at the right moment for something of greater value. Catherine grew up inside rooms that smelled of polish and chalk dust. Tutors came and went. The garden gate stayed latched. She learned to speak French verbs and draw clean lines of geography, while never learning the names of the women who washed her linen or the men who policed those rows of cabins. The county's better families called her pretty for a while, dark-haired, quick-eyed until the talk changed, and the adjectives followed: nervous, fragile, unwell. Then the doctors came like weather: laudanum for the fits, calomel for the humours, mercury to scour the system clean. The dosing chart that lived on her bedside table was as exact as an almanac and twice as cruel. In the years that followed, Catherine's body softened and swelled, her hands trembled, and her voice turned slushy around the edges, the way light distorts in swamp water. She developed an unfortunate habit of seeing straight through people with a kind of lucid anger that made them flinch. It is remarkable what is called madness when a woman refuses to forget. Colleton County had its own calculus for those refusals. The men who mattered kept townhouses in Charleston and their names in one another's mouths. They summered where sea breezes could lift the stink of the rice fields and sent their sons north to learn Latin declensions before returning south to invest in canals and bodies. They measured one another by acreage, by the number of enslaved people on their books, by the ease with which they could ruin a rival with a word and a well-placed debt. Silas hovered on the hem of that circle, rich enough to count but not to decide the counting. He wanted the inner room, oh yes, he did, and he had the look of a man accustomed to trading something dear for the key. The announcement came in April 1841 and landed like a boiling kettle in a parlor full of silk. The county's prominent families gathered in Cypress Grove's dining room beneath the glitter of borrowed chandeliers, their voices low and careful, their knives clattering lightly against imported porcelain. Silas rose, glass in hand, and thanked them with a politeness that rang like a lid closing. He spoke of Catherine's improvements, of a recent change in her regimen, of a new approach to care that had worked where learned men had failed. Then he said he was placing his daughter under the complete authority of a particular enslaved man, Ezekiel Cross, who would control her treatment, her movements, her days, not as nurse, not as companion. Authority. The word hung in the room like a bird pinned to a wall. The reaction was muffled but unmistakable. The quick little coughs of astonishment, the averted eyes, the hands that twitched toward Pearls and stayed there. Mrs. Pelham's painted mouth made a tiny O. Reverend Crenshaw looked momentarily like he had swallowed a burned almond. Marcus Fanning's brow wrinkled in the way men wrinkle their brows when their minds sprint toward the nearest door. Of course, they tried to dress their shock as concern. Of course, they attempted questions. Propriety, alternatives, the availability of a companion of good family. Silas gave them a version of the truth and none of its marrow. His daughter's health mattered more than convention, he said. Sometimes a household must do what the world refuses to understand. Catherine, seated at her father's right, lifted her eyes at the exact right moments, smiled the exact right half-inch, and left crescents of nail in the linen napkin hidden beneath the table edge. The county believed it had been admitted to a grotesque intimacy, a father sacrificing decorum on the altar of care, and that belief would entertain them for weeks. But even scandal is a veil if you hold it at the correct angle. 3 days earlier, Silas had broken the crimson wax on a private letter and found a symbol stamped into it like a blow, a scythe crossed with stalks of wheat. He did not need to read the signature to know who had written. The Brethren of the Harvest had a way of reminding a man that his choices were a circle drawn around him by other hands. He read the letter at his desk, with the shutters latched and the oil lamp low, the way one listens for thunder before it sounds. It recited numbers. First debt is always the overture, $12,000 in advances, side deals made to cushion losses at cards, investments that had rotted faster than the logs they were meant to move. The amount was not just ruinous, it was a public drowning. The Brethren knew precisely how deeply he was sunk because they had held his head there themselves. Then came the alternative, offered in the patient tone of men who enjoy watching the moral math work itself into a corner, a demonstration of commitment, a spectacle with its throat cut. Place your daughter under the complete authority of one of your enslaved men for a full year. Announce it publicly. Make the humiliation total and absolute. In exchange, your ledger will be made light as a feather. Your name will not be spoken in the wrong rooms. Your place at the table will be preserved. Silas sat a long time with his fingertips pressed together, as if prayer might be an arithmetic he had somehow overlooked. Outside, the frogs tuned their throats and the river kept moving as if there were no such thing as human secrets. He considered bankruptcy. The Brethren's reach made it a theatrical notion. Judges, lawyers, lenders, and sheriffs were no more than various doorways into the same hall. He considered the other option, refusal, and pictured the soft brutality of men who never raised their voices when they ruined you. He thought of Catherine as an asset and as a problem, as leverage, as evidence. He thought of the cellar and the old stone and the ways blood soaks into wood. God help him. He thought of the inner circle he had chased his whole life, that bright inner room where even powerful men glowed a little warmer for being seen together. He wrote the acceptance at dawn, the nib scratching like a small animal trapped under a board. His hand did not shake. He was the kind of man who wanted the consequence over with once he had resolved to accept it, and by the time the sun floated up bloated and white over the marsh, a private courier was already on the road, headed to a place where the letter would be read aloud to men who did not need to look at one another to understand. 3 days later came another letter, smaller, brasher, almost jaunty in its economy, a name and a brief professional history. Ezekiel Cross, age 33, recently purchased out of Virginia through an intermediary, skilled in carpentry, knowledgeable in herbal remedies, temperament, quiet, obedient, a man selected, the letter added, with care. Ezekiel arrived on a grey morning in a wagon that rattled like a jaw, driven up the house road instead of toward the barns, a breach of protocol that served as its own announcement. He climbed down from the bed with the effortless care of a body kept fit by work that broke other men. Broad in the shoulder, tall, skin the deep brown of riverbank silt, hands marked more by tools than by whips. When Silas stepped onto the porch, Ezekiel did not drop his gaze. He looked at the white man who had bought him as if studying the grain of a board to decide where the knot would split. The moment was brief and inadvisable and unmistakable. Something upright in Silas's chest withdrew a fraction. Ezekiel Cross, as requested, the trader said, handing over papers already known to be irrelevant. Your associates say this one suits. You understand why you are here? Silas asked. Yes, sir, Ezekiel said, Virginia still softening the consonants. Your daughter is unwell. Doctors have failed, Silas said. I am told you have knowledge. My grandmother was a healer, Ezekiel said, before I was sold. The cabin prepared for him sat within sight of the main house, too close to be casual, too separate to be safe. He was told his duties began at sunrise, and that his responsibility was singular and entire, Miss Catherine. There would be consequences if he failed. He nodded as required and gave the single syllable that makes a lie polite. When the door closed behind him, his face altered in the way muscles relax after being held too long in a shape that pleases other people. From inside his shirt, he drew a tiny cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully, the way one handles a thing that still has teeth. 3 names were written in a child's uncertain hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. The paper had been folded and unfolded so often that the creases looked like scars. He laid the names on the rough plank table and stared until his vision pricked. There are men who carry grief like a stone in the mouth and learn to speak around it. Ezekiel had learned more, to place his grief like bait, to move plantation to plantation following rumors, to listen for the name of the man who had bought and broken his family to prove a theological point about power. He had listened for Ruttled and found it. He had worked his way south the way a river works its bed, patiently, relentlessly, undercutting what looks immovable until one morning the bank simply gives way. He had not been selected by chance. He had made himself the choice that looked like providence to men who admired their own cunning. Night swelled up from the rice flats early. In the main house, candles went down one by one until the second-floor windows were a row of blank eyes. Ezekiel lay back on the narrow bed and reached into the dark for the paper with the names, just to feel the rasp of it against his fingers. Somewhere beneath his feet, the house timbered and settled around its hidden stones. Somewhere deeper still, in a cool chamber no one liked to name, the brethren kept their records and their appetites. In the morning he would walk into a sick room that did not want him and speak to a woman everyone called mad. He would draw open curtains, and he would say a set of words he had practiced until they sounded like a door unlocking. What Silas had announced to Colleton County as medicine was something else entirely. It was debt dressed as devotion. It was theater to distract the audience from the trapdoor. It was the first public move in a private game whose rules were written in other men's blood. In another upstairs room, a girl who remembered too much lay awake and counted the beats of her own heart to keep from screaming. The letter with the scythe and wheat lay in Silas's desk, sated for now. Outside, the river kept its counsel, sliding seaward with all the patience of a plan. By morning, the doctor would be a man who had never studied in any university, and the prisoner would be the owner's daughter. The county would suck the story like a sugar stick, forgetting that sweetness often hides a rot you only taste once it is too late to spit it out. At first light, he would knock on Catherine's door, and the year that ate a plantation would begin. The morning of April 14th broke with the sky the color of pewter, the kind of light that made even the crows hesitant. Ezekiel followed a house slave named Judith up the stairs of Cypress Grove, each step protesting under their weight. The air thick with the smell of old plaster and medicines that lingered in the hall, like a sickness that clung to the walls themselves. Judith paused before a door painted pale green and knocked softly, her eyes flicking to Ezekiel's with a warning in them. "Miss Catherine," she said gently, "your father has brought someone to help with your treatments." From behind the door came the crash of something heavy, glass splintering, wood splintering. A hoarse voice cut through the silence. "I want no more treatments. Leave me." Judith's mouth pinched. "She has bad days," she murmured, then added with quiet resignation, "Most days are bad." Ezekiel did not wait for permission. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was heavy with stale air, curtains drawn so tightly that no sun dared intrude. The smell of mercury, sweet and metallic, burned in his nose. Books lay scattered like fallen leaves. A shattered frame lay beneath the fireplace, and the bed was heaped with linens gone sour from neglect. Catherine sat hunched in a chair, hair uncombed, her dressing gown stained as though it had absorbed her suffering. Her hands trembled constantly, pale fingers twitching against the wooden arms of the chair. Her face was swollen, eyes unfocused, yet there was something alive in them, an ember under ash. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice jagged, not weak, but defensive. "Another doctor, another liar with a bottle of poison." "I'm not a doctor," Ezekiel said. His voice was calm, deliberate. "My name is Ezekiel. Your father asked me to help." Catherine laughed, sharp and brittle. "Help, that is what they all say. Help means chains. Help means silence. He punishes me for remembering." Ezekiel did not move closer. He stayed still, watching her, letting her rage unfold. "Remembering what?" he asked. Her eyes flickered confusion, then suspicion. "You don't know." "Of course you don't. Everyone lies." She turned away, muttering, "I was 12. I saw what they did, and they told me I was mad for saying so." Her words sank into Ezekiel like iron dropped into water. He knew enough not to press, but the shape of truth was already forming between them. He walked to the curtains and drew them open. Sunlight stabbed the room, and Catherine recoiled, covering her face with a low cry. "No," she shrieked. "I cannot. It burns." "When was the last time you saw daylight?" Ezekiel asked quietly. She did not answer, only whispered like a prayer. "The doctors said I must not. The medicine is necessary. They said so." "What if they were wrong?" Ezekiel said. That stopped her. Her trembling slowed, her hands lowered, and for the first time her eyes locked with his, sharp despite the haze. "What did you say? What if your father has been poisoning you, keeping you weak so that you cannot speak of what you saw?" Silence gripped the room like a noose. Catherine's chest heaved, her mouth opening as if to deny, but the ember in her eyes flared. "You," she whispered, "you believe me." "I believe you," Ezekiel answered. For a moment her face softened, then hardened again with suspicion. "If you betray me, I will kill you. I have before. 3 of the house slaves who listened when I spoke and ran to him, I killed them. I do not remember how. The laudanum blurs it, but they vanished, and if you cross me, I will do the same. Ezekiel felt the chill crawl along his spine, but he did not flinch. I don't plan to betray you, he said. She leaned forward, trembling but intent. Then understand this. I want them all dead. My father, the judge, the reverend, every man who stood in that cellar. I want them to beg before the end. Can you give me that? It was the question he had been waiting for. Yes, miss. If you let me, I can make you well enough to remember, well enough to act. Her lips curved into a terrible smile. Then we are not patient and doctor. We are conspirators. She extended her hand. After a moment, Ezekiel took it. Her grip was iron. Over the following days, the conspiracy began in whispers and sweat. Ezekiel reduced her laudanum, replacing it with herbs, valerian root, chamomile, milk thistle. He forced her to eat differently, smaller meals, plainer foods, while she cursed him for denying her the heavy pastries she craved. He made her walk, first to the hallway, then to the stair, her body shaking with exertion. The withdrawal was merciless. She screamed in pain, vomited until her throat was raw, shook with fevers that left her drenched in sweat. Ezekiel stayed by her side, holding basins, wiping her face, speaking low when the shadows of her mind tried to drag her down. At last, the tremors began to fade. Her speech grew clearer. She read again, her eyes no longer lost in fog, and she spoke about the cellar, about the brethren, about nights when she heard chanting under her floorboards. She confessed to a journal, hidden, coded, filled with names and dates, and in return, Ezekiel spoke of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, how his wife had sung while working, how his son could tally sums at 8 years old, how his daughter loved to weave flowers into her hair, how Silas Ruttles had torn them from him not out of need, not even out of cruelty, but to prove to other men that he could. When he told her that, Catherine's eyes glistened with something deeper than madness. Then we have the same enemy, she said, and the same justice to claim. The pact was sealed. Catherine would fight her way back to clarity, and Ezekiel would sharpen his vengeance. And together, they would bring Cypress Grove and every man who met in its cellar down to ash. The spring days that followed became a crucible for Catherine, and Ezekiel was its relentless keeper. The laudanum had ruled her body like a tyrant for years, and now that empire was crumbling brick by agonizing brick. She sweated through her gowns, sheets soaked and clinging, her lips cracked from vomiting until there was nothing left to bring up. At times, she cursed Ezekiel with a fury that made the servants outside her door cross themselves. At other times, she wept like a child, clinging to his wrist, begging for the sweet poison again. Through it all, Ezekiel stayed cool cloths, whispered encouragements, sometimes only his silent presence anchoring her in the storm. At night, when the spasms eased for a moment, she whispered her memories into the darkness, as though confessing to a priest who might grant her absolution. I remember the cellar, she said one night, voice rasping from exhaustion. It smelled of smoke and blood. They said the words over the woman on the table. I was only 12, but I knew it was wrong. He told me I had imagined it. He told everyone, doctors, tutors, even the reverend. Ezekiel listened, jaw clenched, forcing himself not to interrupt. He had to let her speak it aloud, to let the poison of memory seep out like the mercury from her veins. They told me I was mad, she continued, her voice steadying. They gave me medicine so I would forget, but I never forgot, not once. She turned to him then, eyes clear for the first time in years. And now, neither will you. The next days were different. Catherine, though weak, began walking again, first to the end of her chamber, then to the hall, each step trembling but defiant. She began eating real food broth, bread, lean meat that Ezekiel coaxed from the kitchens. He treated her swollen body as one might a wounded animal, coaxing it back to strength without breaking its fragile trust. With each passing day, her mind sharpened like a knife, regaining its edge. She no longer ranted without reason. She no longer shrank from sunlight, and the servants began to whisper of miracles, though they dared not let the master hear. One evening, while Ezekiel read aloud from a book of Psalms words Catherine had once been forced to endure from a preacher who was also her father's ally, she stopped him with a lifted hand. I have something, she said, something I never let him see. From a loose stone near her bed, she drew out a small leather-bound journal, its pages crammed with careful writing. I began it when I was 15, she explained. They thought I was lost in my stupors, but I recorded everything I could, names of visitors, nights when father left, the sounds from below. I wrote it in code in case it was ever found. She pressed the book into his hands. If they kill me, you must keep this. Promise me. Ezekiel turned the worn pages, reading the strange looping symbols, the careful records of nights and names. It was not proof yet, but it was a weapon in waiting. I promise, he said. Catherine's gaze burned into him. Then we are bound, you and I. You seek justice for your family. I seek revenge for myself. But in truth, it is the same thing, the same fire. That night they spoke long after the candles guttered, about Sarah and Ruth and Benjamin, about the brethren's rituals, about the way cruelty clothed itself in silk and scripture. Catherine listened to his grief with a strange, quiet intensity, and when he faltered, she reached for his hand not gently, but firmly, as though she were pulling him back from the brink of drowning. The bond between them was no longer just necessity. It was an alliance forged in rage. Weeks passed, and Catherine's transformation could no longer be hidden. The tremor in her hands lessened, her words grew sharp, her steps steadier. The neighbors who had whispered about her madness would soon be confronted with a woman who had clawed her way back from the edge. And Silas, ever desperate for respectability, saw in her recovery a chance to fashion a spectacle, a performance for the county's elite. Invitations were sent out in embossed envelopes. On April 29th, 41 of the most prominent men and women of Colleton County arrived at Cypress Grove for what they were told was an important family announcement. The tables were laden with oysters, roasted duck, rice stews, and sugared confections. The air hummed with gossip, disguised as politeness. Catherine sat beside her father at the head of the table, her gown clean, her posture straighter, her expression carefully composed. And Ezekiel, in livery, moved silently among them, pouring wine, clearing plates, hearing every mutter, memorizing every name. When the final dish had been cleared, Silas rose, tapped his glass, and prepared to humiliate his daughter before the entire county. What no one realized was that Catherine and Ezekiel were no longer pawns in his plan. They had already begun to play their own. The clinking of silver and porcelain died away as Silas Ruttled lifted his glass, his voice cutting through the murmur of the gathered families like a blade polished thin. "Friends," he began, his pale eyes sweeping the room, "thank you for joining me this evening. You know my Catherine has long suffered from a mysterious affliction. Doctors from Charleston, even a specialist from Philadelphia, could not cure her. Yet here she sits, clearer and calmer than she has been in years." Polite applause rustled through the room, though Catherine sat still as a marble figure, her fingers tightening on her napkin beneath the tablecloth until the linen tore slightly. Silas continued, gesturing toward the man who stood silently against the wall with a pitcher of wine. "2 weeks ago, I entrusted her care to this man, Ezekiel Cross. Though born to bondage, he carries a knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations, and it is he, not the so-called learned physicians, who has brought her back to health." The air thickened with disbelief. Judge Pelham leaned forward, his jaw set hard. "Silas," he said carefully, "surely you do not mean to suggest your daughter's recovery rests in the hands of a slave?" "I mean exactly that," Silas replied, his voice sharpened with pride and hidden malice. "And therefore, I am making permanent what necessity has already proven. From this day forward, Ezekiel will have complete authority over Catherine's treatment, her daily life, her movements. He will assume full responsibility for her welfare." The words struck the guests like a sudden storm. Mrs. Pelham gasped openly, pressing her lace kerchief to her lips. Reverend Crenshaw cleared his throat, his face blotched red. "Silas, this is madness. A companion, a nurse perhaps, but to hand your daughter over to a slave's authority. Do you realize what you are saying?" "I know precisely what I am saying," Silas answered, his voice a hammer against their protests. "And Catherine agrees, do you not, daughter?" Dozens of eyes turned toward her. For the briefest moment, Catherine thought of standing, of revealing everything, of tearing away the mask her father had forced her to wear. But then she caught Ezekiel's gaze, calm, steady, urging patience. Her lips curved into a small, contained smile. "Yes, father," she said softly. "I trust Ezekiel. His treatments help. I am content with this arrangement." The lie rang sweetly, exactly as it needed to. Around the table, whispers erupted, horrified and scandalized. Some tried to mask their disgust with piety. Others leaned toward their neighbors, muttering about propriety, about humiliation, about how the brethren would react when word reached them. Catherine's face remained composed, but under the table her hands shook with fury, her nails breaking skin against her palms. Silas raised his glass as if sealing a contract. "Then it is settled. The remainder of the dinner stumbled forward, guests speaking in strained voices, forcing laughter that rang false. Some excused themselves early, others lingered to corner Silas in private, their words low but urgent. Ezekiel, moving like shadow among them, caught fragments. "The brethren will not be pleased. Are you certain this is wise? You risk too much." Later that night, Catherine sat by her window, still in her dinner gown, staring at the black silhouette of the cypress trees against the moon. Ezekiel entered quietly, setting a candle on the sill. "It is done," she said without looking at him. "I am officially his responsibility. Property of property. How absurd." "Absurd," Ezekiel agreed quietly, "but useful." She turned then, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "Did you see their faces? The disgust, the pity. They think I am pathetic. They have no idea what we are planning." Ezekiel lowered his voice. "And what exactly are we planning, miss?" She went to her dresser, drew out a wooden box, and laid its contents before him, dozens of coded pages, written in a hand both precise and fevered. "My journals," she said. "Years of memories they told me were madness. Dates, names, rituals. I wrote them all. It will look like nonsense to anyone else, but I can decode it. And there is more. There is a ledger. They keep a record of everything they have done, every ritual, every sacrifice. It is hidden in the cellar, in a chamber beyond the one I saw as a child." Ezekiel's pulse quickened. Proof. Not just whispers and memories, but evidence that could damn them all. "How do you know it is there?" "I heard them speak of it," Catherine whispered. "It ensures mutual guilt. No man can betray the brethren without condemning himself." She leaned closer, her voice sharp as broken glass. 2 weeks from now, Father will leave for Charleston. He will be gone 3 days. That is when we go into the cellar. That is when we take the ledger." Ezekiel looked at her, at this woman who had once been drugged into submission and now spoke like a general preparing for war. He thought of his wife's songs, his son's eager questions, his daughter's soft hands. He thought of Silas's smile as he tore them away. His jaw tightened. "Then we go," he said. Catherine's lips curved into something between a smile and a snarl. "Good, because I want every one of them to burn." After the dinner, the house returned to its ordinary night noises, the slow thud of shutters settling, the distant croak of frogs, the soft recurring sigh of the Combe River as it eased along its bank. But inside Cypress Grove the air had changed. Something taut and charged threaded the rooms, like a wire strung between 2 poles. Silas believed he had staged a spectacle and hardened himself against gossip. He did not know that what he had set in motion was less a performance than a clockwork release with hands he could not command. The date in Catherine's journal was circled in ink the way a target is circled by a hunter. May 14th. Silas's monthly trip to Charleston. 3 days alone of business and dinners and other men's laughter. For Catherine and Ezekiel it was a window, narrow, sharp and terrifying. For 2 weeks they prepared with the patience of people building a raft out of splinters and fate. First came information. Catherine, with the clear mind modern medicine had not given her, but pain and stubborn memory had sat Ezekiel down and walked him through every creak of the house she could remember. She sketched the pantry and the hidden panel. She described the cellar stairs, the uneven step with the notch carved by years of bare feet, the hook in the wall by the 3rd landing where a spare lamp usually hung. She told him which servant kept which keys, which overseer fell asleep during the afternoon checks, which door was never locked because no gentleman would think to lock his own cellar. The details read like an inventory and like a prayer. Ezekiel walked the routes he could. He listened at doors. He watched the men who came to the study. He noted routines who came with the evening post, who drank too much and stumbled back to his carriage, which of the house slaves had sympathetic eyes. He found Judith's face when she thought no one watched an island of pity in a sea of trained indifference, and asked a simple, dangerous thing: would she help? Judith's hands trembled at the question. She had been at Cypress Grove long enough to know the price of speaking and the price of silence. She did not say yes out loud. She did not have to. A slow nod was more precious than any oath. They needed tools and excuses. Ezekiel borrowed small things from the carpenter's bench and hid them among his few belongings. A file, a stout chisel wrapped in oilskin, a length of rope. He practiced handling them at night when the moon lay like a silver coin on the yard. Catherine sharpened the ledger of names in her head, rehearsing the way she would describe the hidden room to someone who could read what she could not yet reveal publicly. There were, she insisted, particular entries, names in the ledger that mattered more than others. Names with dates that matched, strange disappearances in neighboring counties, mentions of a man from Virginia who sold off a family in the fall of 1838, Ezekiel's fingers ached when he thought of those lines. Silas was not blind to the way eyes met across tables. He kept watch from his study more often than he let others see, his head bent low over the inks of his account books. The brethren's letter had relieved his debts at first and then tightened the knot around his throat. He smiled and instructed and observed. When his guests made thin jokes about the spectacle of handing his daughter over, he laughed them off. When they leaned toward the private corners and muttered, he listened. Men like Pelham and Crenshaw offered friendly counsel and then left with the air of men who had reminded a younger brother of his place. Silas took the counsel because he must and also because he liked the rustle of power that came with being correct in the end. Still, caution ran like a vein through the house. Keys were moved more carefully. A carriage that used to be left near the stables was brought closer to the lane. Silas had an appetite for control and now, perhaps without admitting it even to himself, a measure of fear that made him check locks twice. He trusted the brethren's calculus that mutual guilt made men durable. He also understood that those who could remember were liabilities. He tucked that knowledge into the same drawer where he kept the brethren's letters and tried to sleep. 2 weeks is long when you are pretending to do nothing. It is longer when you are marshalling a conspiracy. Catherine's improvement continued. Her face grew less puffy. Light returned to her step, and servants who had once trailed away from her doorway now paused to watch. Where once she had been a subject of pity, she became an object of dangerous curiosity. She used that curiosity carefully. She spoke with kitchen hands and field hands in the most ordinary ways, asking about the weather, about the speed at which the rice would be cut while others listened in. She noted which men had lost someone recently, which women had a brother sold away, which mothers kept the corners of their grief, hidden like coins in their aprons. She planted tiny seeds, an offhand remark about a frightened boy who never came back to his cabin, an observation about a man who always dug late into the night and never explained why. For some, the talk was simply the chance to let a truth out and then bite the tongue shut again. At night, she and Ezekiel sat with the stolen candle between them and went through the cellar's map piece by piece. He learned where the hidden latch sat, which stone would fall if pressed, which set of floorboards would protest if trod on. She taught him the cadence of the brethren's chants so he would know. In the dark, when the ritual was not merely a sound but a signal, he learned the names that would matter: Pelham, Crenshaw, Fanning, Lyle, so the ledger's entries would not be abstract but targets. When they finished, they had a plan that balanced audacity with the kind of small practicalities that win desperate wars. Timing, route, who would hold the kitchen's back door, where Judith might leave a tray so the house's routine would swallow the absence of motion. On May 14th, the carriage rolled away toward Charleston under a low sky. Silas kissed his handkerchief as if to bless the day and waved off his man with the grand gestures that men use to reassure themselves. The house seemed to breathe out. Servants relaxed into the lull, patterned after a master's absence. That evening, as light thinned, Catherine changed her clothing into darker, less conspicuous garments. She braided her hair back the way her grandmother had taught daughters on long afternoons before the family name made some things forbidden. Ezekiel, his hands steady now where they had trembled when he first unwrapped his family's names, took the chisel and wrapped it again in oilskin and slipped it beneath his shirt. They met in the pantry when the kitchen's clatter had receded. Judith moved like someone rehearsed, placing a tray near the door and angling it so that the house's route, always the same in well-run plantations, would mask two people slipping past. Ezekiel's breath smelled of iron. Catherine's hand, when she touched his arm in parting, was cool and certain. He pressed the wall where she had indicated. A stone moved soft as a letter under thumb. In the hush, the panel clicked. They descended. The air grew cooler with each step, smelling of earth and old smoke, and the slow sourness of things left too long unread. At the bottom, a darkness hung like a curtain. They paused on the threshold. Above them, the house, its lights, its voices felt a world away. Beneath their boots, the wood creaked. Catherine's palm was at his shoulder. "Ready," she whispered. He answered with his hand on the chisel and the paper with his family's names folded against his heart. The stone before them swallowed the light of the lantern as they pushed forward. Something moved in the dark beyond the next corner. An animal, the settling of the house, or a footstep. For a second, the world narrowed to the sound of that small motion and to the candle flame guttering low in the lantern. Then they stepped forward into the cellar's mouth and whatever waited beyond the first bend held secrets that both feared and hungered for. They pressed on, knowing with a clarity that cuts sharper than any blade that when the ledger was found, nothing of their earlier lives would remain the same. The cellar stairs groaned as if they resented each step. Ezekiel's lantern cast long, quivering shadows against the stone, stretching across walls slick with moisture. The air grew colder as they descended, and Catherine's face tightened not from fear, but from memory. When they reached the earthen floor, Ezekiel set the lantern on a beam and let it breathe just enough light into the chamber. The sight was worse than Catherine's words had prepared him for. The room was broad, low-ceilinged, and heavy with a smell that seemed older than either of them. The sour rot of blood absorbed into wood, the musk of smoke, the faintest stench of decay. In the center stood a massive wooden table too rough to be furniture, too purposeful to be mistaken for anything else. Dark grooves cut into its surface told their own story, and the stains that marred it were too numerous to count. "That is where they do it," Catherine said, her voice quiet but edged like glass. "I was 12. They thought I was asleep, but I heard the chanting, followed the sound. I hid behind that wall. I saw them cut a woman while she screamed, and she stopped, her mouth twisting as though bile rose in her throat. And I saw my father drink from a cup filled with her blood." Ezekiel said nothing. Words would have been an insult here. Instead, he scanned the chamber, the shelves lined with jars sealed in wax, the black robes hanging from hooks, the stacks of boxes with their lids nailed shut. Every object felt like a witness to a crime no law would punish. Catherine led him past the table toward the far wall. Her fingers traced the outline of a stone rougher than the rest. She pressed, and with a soft scrape the wall clicked open. A hidden door swung inward. The second chamber was smaller, square, suffocating, and at its center rested the thing both of them had come for. A great ledger, nearly 2 feet tall, bound in cracked leather with iron clasps. Around it lay smaller journals, neat stacks of parchment, jars filled with things Ezekiel dared not examine closely. "There," Catherine whispered, her eyes fixed on the book. "That is what binds them all." Ezekiel approached the ledger with the reverence one might give a coffin. He unclasped the metal and turned the first page. His breath caught. Names, dates, rituals. Each entry was precise, clinical, stripped of emotion, as though recording the weather. Sacrifices performed every 6 weeks, tied to crop cycles. Victims listed enslaved men and women, poor whites, wandering children disappeared without trace. Some entries spoke not just of killing but of consuming, the preparation of flesh described in obscene detail, as if cruelty became more powerful once ingested. Ezekiel turned the pages faster now, his heart hammering, until his eyes fell upon the year 1838. October. 3 lines. Purchased family unit from Virginia. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. Separated male to demonstrate resolve. Female and children sent to Alabama contact. Payment received. The world seemed to tilt. His knees nearly gave way. 3 lives, reduced to a notation in ink. His wife, his son, his daughter collapsed into the ledger of a society that considered itself civilized. His hand trembled as he traced the words. This is all they were worth to him. 3 lines. His voice was hoarse. 3 lines. Catherine touched his arm. "Now you understand why I want them all to suffer. It is not madness. It is justice." They worked in silence after that. Catherine produced paper and ink from her gown and began copying entries, names of current members, records of rituals, evidence no whisper could deny. Ezekiel, teeth clenched, listed victims' names and dates, building a roll of the forgotten dead. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. More than once Ezekiel had to stop, shaking with fury at the things he read. Once Catherine left the chamber entirely, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. But still they worked, page after page, until their notes piled high. They were so focused, they didn't hear the footsteps, until it was too late. A sudden flare of light blinded them. Ezekiel turned sharply, his hand reaching for the chisel at his belt. In the doorway stood Silas Ruttled, lantern in hand, his face calm as marble. Behind him loomed 2 men, Pelham and Crenshaw, shadows with guns. And in the outer chamber, Ezekiel counted 4 more shapes moving in the glow. Silas stepped into the room, his eyes drifting from the ledger to Catherine. "I must admit," he said softly, "I am impressed. I did not think you would find the inner chamber." Catherine straightened, her body trembling but her gaze steady. "You were supposed to be in Charleston." "I was supposed to be," Silas agreed, his voice low and cold. "But I never trusted your miraculous recovery. I left this morning, yes, but I returned this afternoon. I watched the house. I watched you. I knew you would lead me here." He stepped closer, the other men blocking the only exit. "Did you really think I would not anticipate this? That I would not prepare for the possibility you might remember, might seek revenge?" Catherine's voice was steel. You poisoned me for 16 years, and you expect me to thank you for it. Silas's expression didn't change. I expect you to understand it was necessary. You saw something you should not have. A child cannot comprehend the responsibilities of men. I did what I must to protect us. I was 12, she hissed, and I watched you murder a woman. I watched you drink her blood. That was not protection. That was evil. Silas's jaw tightened, but his eyes shifted to Ezekiel. And you, he said, using my daughter to get to me, filling her head with fantasies of revenge. Ezekiel said nothing. He was calculating, measuring distance, counting men. 7 against 1 and Catherine in no shape to fight. Impossible odds. Silas seemed to read his silence. Do not be foolish. I do not want to hurt either of you, not yet, but you will come upstairs, and we will decide what happens next. The men closed in, the ledger, the journals, the evidence. They could not be taken now, and for the first time since they had begun, Ezekiel felt the crushing weight of defeat settle over him. They had been caught, and the brethren was waiting. They were dragged upstairs like prisoners of war, though no chains clinked. The brethren preferred silence. It made the punishment feel cleaner, more inevitable. Silas led the procession, his lantern throwing crooked shadows on the plaster walls as they moved. Catherine's feet stumbled, but her head stayed high, her jaw locked against the terror rippling beneath her calm. They were thrown into Silas's study, the heavy oak door locked behind them with a scrape that sounded final. The room was close and airless, lined with shelves of ledgers and maps, but the high transom window admitted no hope of escape. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Catherine pulled something from her gown, folded sheets hidden in her bodice, pages she had copied before Silas appeared. He didn't search me, she whispered, her voice low and shaking with suppressed triumph. He thought I was too broken to be clever. Ezekiel looked at her in astonishment. You risked everything. We risk everything every hour, she answered sharply. At least now we hold something. He pressed his forehead to the wall, trying to think. It will not matter if we die tonight. Catherine moved closer, her face fierce in the lamplight. Then we cannot die tonight. He still sees me as his daughter. That buys us time. He will not kill me outright if he has another way. Their time was short. Voices gathered in the hall outside, men arriving in haste. Catherine recognized the names as they passed: Pelham, Crenshaw, Fanning, the entire brethren, summoned like wolves to a carcass. At last the door opened. Marcus Fanning, eyes grim, stood in the threshold. They are ready for you. Come and you will not be harmed. Harmed. The word was obscene. Yet Ezekiel and Catherine were marched back down, past the same cellar door, past the stairs they had descended in secret hours before. This time no lantern was shuttered. This time the descent was public. The cellar had been transformed. Candles filled every holder, casting the room in a bloody glow. The heavy table was draped in crimson cloth. 13 chairs had been arranged in a circle, each occupied by a robed figure, all but one. The seat at the head of the altar stood empty, waiting for Silas. The two were forced to stand at the center of the circle, the weight of every gaze pressing on them. Catherine's breath hitched, but she forced herself not to falter. Silas stepped forward, pulling back his hood. Brothers of the harvest, he said evenly, thank you for coming. Tonight, we face a crisis. My daughter and this man have uncovered what should never have been seen. They entered our inner chamber. They saw the ledger. They began copying its pages. A ripple of fury moved through the circle. Judge Pelham rose slightly in his chair. Then they must be silenced. Now, permanently. I disagree. Silas raised a hand. My daughter is blood. She need not be destroyed if another path exists, and the man he may represent an opportunity. Murmurs. Catherine frowned, not understanding. Ezekiel's chest tightened. Silas turned to him. You hate me, Ezekiel. You hate what I did to your family. I understand that. But what if I told you there was another way? Not vengeance in shadows, but vengeance with power. Ezekiel said nothing, his dark eyes fixed. Silas continued, his voice smooth and persuasive, the voice of a merchant selling damnation, as though it were salvation. Join us. Not as an equal, you will never sit as a brother, but as an associate. You will attend our gatherings, you will take part in our rituals, and in return, I will give you what you want most. Revenge on the man in Alabama who killed your wife and children, Edward Gaines. He is not one of us. He has no protection. With our resources, we can deliver him to you. His suffering will be yours to orchestrate. Ezekiel's stomach turned. The offer was poison wrapped in gold. And if I refuse? He asked, his voice flat. Then you die, Silas replied simply. You both die. Your bodies vanish into the swamp. Your copies burn, your story ends. But if you accept, you live. Catherine lives, and you will have your revenge. The chamber waited. The chanting of men in robes began to hum low in the background, a sound like the grinding of stones. Catherine's hand brushed Ezekiel's arm, subtle but urgent. Her lips barely moved. Don't. Silas stepped closer, eyes glinting in the candlelight. Choose. Join us, or perish. Ezekiel looked at Catherine. Her face was pale but unbroken. She was telling him with her eyes, no matter the cost, do not let them make you into one of them. But Ezekiel also knew that if he refused, she would die beside him. He could not let that happen. So he lifted his head, looked straight at Silas and said, I accept, but on one condition. The circle stilled. Catherine goes free. Not back to her room, not to your poison. Free. She leaves South Carolina. She starts a new life. If you want me, that is the price. The brethren stirred angrily, voices raised in protest. But Judge Pelham leaned forward, lips curling. The boy makes a point. The girl is ruined. Who would believe her if she spoke? But a man like him hating us, yet joining us, that proves our power. That is worth something. Silas studied Ezekiel, then Catherine. At last he nodded. Very well. Catherine will be sent north. Philadelphia. A stipend, a new name, a new life. She will never return here. Never speak of this place again. If she does, she dies, but she will leave alive. Catherine's face twisted in fury. No, I will not leave you to them. You must. Ezekiel interrupted sharply, eyes steady on hers. Go, live, I will survive. And in that moment, she understood. This was not surrender. This was a strategy. Silas smiled faintly. Then it is decided. The brethren had won, or so they believed. But Catherine and Ezekiel both knew the truth. The game had only just begun. The night of June 3rd was thick with heat, the air unmoving, as though the very world held its breath. Ezekiel had not slept the evening before, lying in his narrow cabin, the paper with his family's names pressed to his chest. Silas had visited him in secret hours before, whispering like a serpent, warning him that initiation would require proof, that hesitation would mean death, not just for him but for Catherine wherever she hid. When the overseers came for him, Ezekiel let them bind his wrists, let them march him shirtless into the cellar like an offering. The chamber had been prepared for spectacle. 13 robed figures stood in a circle, their crimson trim gleaming in candlelight. The altar dressed once more in cloth as red as blood. Silas presided, his hood down, his eyes glinting with triumph. Brothers of the harvest, he declared, his voice carrying the smug gravity of ceremony. Tonight we welcome an associate, a man who hated us, yet who has bent to our will. Tonight our strength is proven greater than vengeance itself. 2 men dragged forward a struggling figure bound and gagged. A young woman barely grown, her wrists raw from rope. She was laid upon the altar, her eyes wide and shining with tears. Ezekiel's heart thudded like a drum in his chest. This, Silas said, producing a long knife, is your test. Take the blade, make the first cut. Show that your desire for revenge is stronger than your weakness for pity. The circle began to hum, their voices chanting in the old cadence, low and steady, like the sound of bees in a hive. Shadows leapt on the walls. Silas extended the knife. Ezekiel took it. The girl's eyes met his. In them, he saw Sarah, holding Benjamin's hand as men tore them apart. He saw Ruth, refusing to eat, her little body curling in despair. He saw every man and woman who had vanished into the swamp, their voices silenced by these cowards in robes. The knife was cold in his hand, and then he moved, not toward the girl, toward the man at his left. The blade flashed in candlelight and buried itself deep in a throat. The robed figure gurgled, blood spraying across the crimson cloth. Chows erupted. Ezekiel tore the robe from the falling body and flung it across the candles, plunging half the chamber into sudden darkness. He seized a heavy candlestick, swung it into another man's face with a sickening crack. Bodies stumbled, screams tangled with chants. The circle dissolved into a frenzy of frightened, untrained men who had spent their lives wielding money, not steel. The girl on the altar thrashed. Ezekiel cut her ropes with the same knife and shoved her toward the stairs. Run, he bellowed. Run now. She fled, feet pounding up the wooden steps. But Ezekiel was not alone. From above, the door to the cellar burst open. Catherine descended, her gown traded for plain dark clothes, her hair bound tightly, and behind her dozens of figures, men and women carrying scythes, axes, iron tools. Enslaved people of Cypress Grove and neighboring plantations, faces set with fury long held in silence. They had come for blood. For weeks, Catherine had been working in secret, slipping into slave quarters by night, speaking words of truth about the brethren, about the cellar, about the rituals. She had not begged. She had told them what she had seen, and that tonight they could end it. 23 had answered. The brethren never heard them until it was too late. The enslaved people poured into the chamber like a tide of vengeance. Screams rose as axes fell, as pitchforks drove through silk and flesh. Judge Pelham tried to draw his pistol, but a hammer shattered his hand before he could fire. Reverend Crenshaw cried for mercy, but none came. Men who had lived their lives untouchable, hidden behind titles and rituals, now found themselves prey. In the chaos, Silas grabbed Catherine, pulling her against him with a knife pressed to her throat. His voice cut through the roar. "Stop, stop or she dies." The cellar froze for a heartbeat. Catherine met her father's eyes and laughed. Cold, merciless laughter. "Kill me then. It changes nothing. You have already lost." She drove her elbow into his ribs with vicious force. The knife slipped. She spun away, and before Silas could recover, Ezekiel was there. For a moment they faced each other, master and slave, predator and prey. All the power Silas had wielded, all the cruelty he had inflicted, dissolved into this single confrontation. "You took everything from me," Ezekiel said, his voice low and shaking with contained rage. "My wife, my son, my daughter. You smiled while you did it." Silas's lips trembled. For the first time, he looked like a man, not a master, not a brother, not a god in ritual robes. Just a man facing the end. "Please," he whispered. "Did Sarah beg?" Ezekiel asked. "Did Benjamin? Did Ruth? Did any of the people you butchered in this cellar?" Silas said nothing, and Ezekiel's knife answered for him. The blade sank, swift and final, and Silas Ruttled fell, choking, to the stained earth where he had slaughtered so many others. The chamber shook with cries not of fear but of release, of a fury unleashed after generations of silence. The brethren, 13 men who had believed themselves immortal in their secrecy, were cut down to the last. The reckoning had come, and the cellar of Cypress Grove drank deeply of the blood of its masters. The cellar was no longer a chamber of ritual. It was a battlefield drenched in smoke and blood. The crimson cloth was torn, the altar toppled, the candlelight guttering against walls that had absorbed generations of cruelty. The brethren, who once carried themselves as gods cloaked in secrecy, lay broken and scattered across the dirt floor like any other men. Their robes were torn, their blood indistinguishable from that of the enslaved they had tormented. Ezekiel stood amidst it all, chest heaving, the blade still slick in his hand. Catherine was beside him, her hair loose, her gown torn, her face pale but triumphant. For the first time in 16 years, she was free of trembling, free of poison, free of silence. Judith, the house servant who had guided Ezekiel upstairs weeks ago, stepped forward with a lantern. Her face, lined with years of quiet endurance, was unreadable. "It's done," she whispered. "They're gone." But Catherine shook her head. "Not yet." She turned toward Ezekiel, her voice iron. "The ledger, the journals, they cannot remain. If the others, the brethren in Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, ever learn what happened here, they will come for us. We must burn it all." Ezekiel hesitated, his eyes on the massive book still sitting in the secret chamber, its pages heavy with names. "This ledger is proof. With it, we could expose them." Catherine's laugh was bitter, edged with exhaustion. "Expose them? To whom? The courts, the governors. They are all men like my father, feeding from the same trough. They would burn us, not the brethren. No, the only justice is here, in fire." She was right, and he knew it. But Ezekiel could not abandon everything. He went to the ledger, opened it once more, and tore free the pages that bore the names of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth. He folded them carefully, tucked them against his chest. "For them," he said softly, "so they will not be forgotten." Catherine met his eyes. "That much, yes. Keep them alive in memory. But the rest," together, they piled the journals, the ledger, and the robes onto the altar. Ezekiel fetched oil from the kitchen, sloshed it across the wood until the air was sharp with its scent. Catherine struck a match, her hand steady, and held the flame to the drenched cloth. The fire caught quickly, greedy, racing up the soaked timbers. The altar became an inferno, the ledger curling, blackening, its pages consumed until names became smoke. The fire leapt to the beams above. Within minutes, the cellar was an oven. "Out," Ezekiel said, pulling Catherine toward the stairs. "Now." They emerged into the night as flames burst from the cellar windows, licking the house timbers. Cypress Grove, proud in its white columns, began to glow red, the fire spreading fast through walls dry with years of summer heat. Servants and enslaved people scattered, some fleeing into the trees, others staring in silent awe as the seat of their suffering roared into an unholy pyre. Catherine and Ezekiel stood in the yard, the blaze painting their faces gold and scarlet. Catherine's eyes reflected the flames, unblinking. "It's finished," Ezekiel said. "No," Catherine replied, her voice calm but resolute. "It's begun." They waited until the roof groaned and collapsed, until sparks rained upward into the dark like 1,000 souls freed at last. Cypress Grove Plantation was reduced to a skeleton of embers, its legacy buried in ash. By dawn, the official story was already shaping itself. The enslaved who remained would say nothing. They knew survival depended on silence. Outsiders would see only a fire, perhaps a candle overturned, a tragic accident, 13 prominent men gone, their secrets erased in flame. Catherine turned to Ezekiel, her face illuminated by the first thin light of day. "What will you do now?" He drew out the pages he had saved, the names of his wife and children. His voice was quiet. "Go north, find others, build a way out for those still trapped. If the brethren can weave networks of cruelty, then I can weave one of escape." "And me?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. "You go to Charleston, then farther. Disappear. Take what money you can from what's left of your father's accounts. Live free." She nodded, though her eyes held a shadow of sorrow. "We will not see each other again." "No," Ezekiel said, "but we will both carry this night with us. That is enough." They stood together one final moment, watching the flames consume the last of Silas Rutledge's empire. Then, without ceremony, they turned in opposite directions, Ezekiel toward the frontier, Catherine toward the coast. Behind them, Cypress Grove fell silent but for the crackle of embers, its secrets sealed in ash. The county would mourn their lost leaders, drape black cloth over pews, and speak their names with reverence. But in the cabins, in the quarters, in the whispered stories that traveled farther than any ledger could, another tale took root. The night the masters burned, and 2 broken souls lit the match. Colleton County awoke to smoke. The dawn light revealed Cypress Grove as a blackened carcass against the horizon. Its white columns collapsed. Its roof sagged into the cellar like a ribcage burned from within. By midday, carriages from neighboring plantations arrived, their occupants fanning themselves against the heat and murmuring in tones of shock and pity. The official word spread quickly. A tragic accident. A lantern overturned, a fire racing through the cellar, 13 men trapped below, all overcome by smoke before they could flee. The funerals that followed were lavish. Black crepe hung from Charleston parlors, ministers thundered about the fragility of earthly life, and newspapers mourned the loss of pillars of Southern society. Silas Rutledge was eulogized as a man of honor burdened with a difficult daughter, whose unfortunate death in the flames made the tragedy all the sharper. Catherine's name was spoken with sighs, as though she were a victim of her own frailty. No one asked why the cellar doors had been barred from within. No one thought to question the timing, but the enslaved remembered. They scattered quickly in the weeks that followed, sold to other plantations when Cypress Grove's debts were settled, or disappearing into the night when chaos gave them cover. None of them spoke openly. Silence was survival. Yet in cabins lit only by embers, stories bloomed. Stories of a night when 13 masters bled and screamed, when a woman thought mad proved sharper than any blade, when an enslaved man struck the first blow in a reckoning long overdue. The stories grew and shifted with each retelling. Sometimes Catherine was the one who slit Silas's throat. Sometimes it was Ezekiel who set the fire while chanting curses in an old tongue. Sometimes the ledger was said to have been saved whole, hidden in a swamp, waiting to be found. But always, the core of the story remained. Cruelty met its reckoning in fire, and the powerless seized power, if only for a night. Years passed. Cypress Grove's ruins sank back into the earth. By the Civil War, Union soldiers marched over its ashes without knowing what had been buried there. They found fragments, tunnels dug into the swamp, bones tangled in tree roots, strange markings carved into beams. But war gave no time for investigation. The soldiers moved on. The land was sold, rebuilt, renamed, and still the whispers remained. In 1971, during demolition of an old structure near the site, workers discovered a journal sealed in a wall cavity. Its pages were brittle, the handwriting coded in looping symbols. County clerks filed it as a curiosity, but before it could be properly studied, it vanished from records. Some claimed descendants of the brethren seized it to protect their family names. Others believed it was destroyed. A few insisted it still exists somewhere, tucked in a private archive, waiting for the right hands to open it. What is known is this: 13 prominent men died in 1841, consumed in fire beneath a plantation house. Catherine Ruttall disappeared from history. No body was ever identified among the ash. An enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross was recorded as sold to Alabama shortly after, but no such bill of sale was ever found. Instead, stories circulated of a man with scars on his knuckles, moving quietly along the Underground Railroad, helping others vanish into freedom. Was it Ezekiel? Was it wishful invention by those who needed to believe justice had not burned out with the fire? No one can say. But sometimes truth survives not in ledgers or courts, but in the stories people tell, in the way names are whispered around hearth fires, in the refusal to forget. Cypress Grove may be gone, its columns collapsed, its land replanted and paved over, yet the story breathes. A warning, a reckoning, a reminder. Power built on cruelty is never eternal. Secrets buried in darkness eventually claw their way to the light, and in the flames of that South Carolina night, justice ragged, imperfect, and merciless found its voice. So what do you believe? Was Catherine truly lost in the fire, or did she slip away under another name? Did Ezekiel fall in Alabama's fields, or did he rise to lead others toward freedom? And what of the ledger burned to ash, or hidden, still waiting for someone to read the truth it carried? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and if you want more tales where history and horror meet in the shadows, subscribe and ring the bell, because some stories are too dark to stay buried forever.